The howl of the wind cut through the late December evening like a wolf's cry, drowning out the soft whimpers of Rachel Dawson as she trudged through knee-deep snow, her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. The year was 1878, and Breckenridge, Colorado, was experiencing one of the harshest winters in memory. Rachel's breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air as she fought to take another step toward the faint glow of lights in the distance. "Just a little further," she whispered to her unborn children, feeling their restless movement beneath her frozen hands. "We're almost there." But her body, already weakened from days of travel with little food and inadequate shelter, had reached its limit. The lights of the town blurred as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. Rachel felt a sharp pain tear through her abdomen. The babies were coming, and they were coming now. With a final gasp, her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed into the snow, her burgundy dress spreading around her like spilled wine against the white canvas. Jacob Quinn had been checking the fence line of his property at the edge of Breckenridge when he spotted what looked like a splash of color against the pristine snow about 50 yards from his cabin. Squinting through the falling dusk and whirling snowflakes, he realized with a shock that it was a person. "Whoa there, Maverick," he said to his horse, turning him sharply. Jacob kicked his heels into the stallion's sides and galloped toward the fallen figure, his heart pounding harder than his horse's hooves. As he approached, the form took shape: a woman, clearly with child, lying motionless in the snow. Jacob leapt from his horse before Maverick had fully stopped, his boots sinking deep as he rushed to her side. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked urgently, brushing snow from her pale face. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. She mumbled something incoherent, her hand clutching weakly at her belly. It was then Jacob noticed the dampness seeping through her dress and the unmistakable signs of labor. "Hold on," he said firmly, his voice steadier than his hands. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm." As gently as possible, Jacob slid his arms beneath her, lifting her from the snow. Her weight surprised him, heavier than expected for her frame, and distributed strangely. The realization hit him like a bullet when he felt two distinct movements against his chest. "Twins," he breathed, looking down at the semi-conscious woman in his arms. "You're carrying twins." With renewed urgency, Jacob placed her carefully on Maverick, mounted behind her, and wrapped one strong arm around her to keep her secure. The journey to his cabin felt like the longest of his 30 years on Earth, though it took barely 5 minutes at a careful trot. Once at his cabin door, he dismounted with her in his arms and kicked the door open, the warmth from his cast-iron stove enveloping them as he carried her inside. The woman moaned, her eyes flickering open briefly. "My babies," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. "You're safe now," Jacob assured her, laying her on his bed. "Both you and your little ones." He hurried to stoke the fire, his mind racing. The nearest doctor was in town, a good 3 miles away through the worsening blizzard. There was no time to fetch help. These babies were coming now, ready or not. Rachel drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of strong arms carrying her, the blessed warmth of a fire, and the rough but gentle hands of a stranger. Pain ripped through her body in waves, each one stronger than the last. "What's your name?" The man's deep voice pulled her back from the edge of darkness. "Rachel," she managed to whisper. "Rachel Dawson." "I'm Jacob Quinn," he replied, placing a cool cloth on her forehead. "And I reckon I'm about to help bring your children into this world, Miss Dawson." Rachel wanted to explain, to tell him about the husband who'd abandoned her when he learned she was carrying twins, about the long journey from St. Louis to find her sister in Denver, about being robbed and left on the wrong stagecoach that had broken down 10 miles outside Breckenridge. But another contraction seized her, stealing her words and her breath. "Push," Jacob instructed, his voice firm but kind. "That's it. You can do this, Rachel." Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Jacob worked tirelessly, drawing on half-remembered knowledge from helping birth countless foals and calves, and the single time he'd assisted the town doctor with a human birth years before. His hands remained steady even as his heart raced with fear that this woman or her babies might die here in his small cabin in the Colorado wilderness. At last, a tiny cry pierced the night. Jacob held a squirming, red-faced baby boy in his weathered hands. "You have a son," he told Rachel, quickly tying off the cord and wrapping the infant in a clean shirt. But there was no time to celebrate, the second baby was already coming. "Almost there," Jacob encouraged. "One more time." With a final, exhausted push, Rachel delivered her second child, another boy, smaller than his brother but with an equally powerful set of lungs. Jacob cleaned and wrapped the second infant, then placed both babies in their mother's trembling arms. "Twin boys," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Beautiful, perfect boys." Jacob turned away to give her privacy, busying himself with stoking the fire and preparing some broth. When he turned back, Rachel was gazing at him with a look that clutched at something deep in his chest. "You saved us," she said simply. "All three of us would have died in that snow if not for you." Jacob shook his head, suddenly uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rachel replied with certainty. "Not anyone. Not my husband, who left us the moment he learned there were two babies instead of one." Jacob's jaw tightened. The idea of a man abandoning his wife and unborn children struck him as the worst kind of cowardice. "Well, you're safe now. You and the little ones can stay until the weather clears and you're strong enough to travel." Rachel smiled weakly, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I don't even know where I'm going anymore." "That's a worry for another day," Jacob told her, pulling a chair beside the bed. "For now, you need to rest." As Rachel drifted into a deep, healing sleep, Jacob found himself watching the rise and fall of her chest and the tiny movements of the newborn boys nestled against her. Something fierce and protective awakened in him, something he'd never felt before, even after 12 years of solitude in this mountain town. The blizzard howled outside, but inside the cabin, Jacob Quinn felt an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Days passed, and the snow continued to fall. Jacob slept on a makeshift pallet near the stove, giving Rachel and the twins his bed. He hunted when the weather allowed, bringing back rabbit and deer to make hearty stew and broth to help Rachel regain her strength. When not tending to his livestock or hunting, he found himself cradling one or both of the infants while Rachel slept, marveling at their tiny fingers and the way they seemed to study his face. "They need names," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Rachel nursing one baby while Jacob held the other. Rachel nodded. "I've been thinking on that. The firstborn, I'd like to call him Samuel after my father." "Samuel," Jacob repeated, testing the name. "It's a good, strong name." "And this one," she said, looking down at the baby at her breast, "I thought perhaps Thomas for my grandfather." "Samuel and Thomas Dawson," Jacob said. "Fine names for fine boys." Rachel hesitated. "Actually, I wasn't planning to use their father's name. He doesn't deserve that honor." Jacob looked at her in surprise. "What will their surname be then?" "I hadn't decided," she admitted. "Perhaps just my maiden name, Davis." Jacob nodded slowly. "Samuel and Thomas Davis, that has a good ring to it." The baby in his arms, Samuel yawned widely, his tiny fist waving in the air. Without thinking, Jacob offered his finger and the infant grasped it with surprising strength. Something twisted in Jacob's chest, a feeling both painful and sweet. "You're good with them," Rachel observed softly. Jacob shrugged, embarrassed. "Never had much experience with babies before this." "Plenty with calves and foals, but humans are different." "Not as different as you might think," Rachel smiled. "They need the same things: food, warmth, love." "And you?" Jacob asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "What do you need, Rachel?" Her green eyes met his, steady and clear. "Right now, a safe place for my sons to grow, a chance to build something new." Jacob nodded, looking away to hide the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "You've got that here for as long as you need it." The blizzard finally broke after a week, revealing a world transformed into gleaming white sculptures. Jacob made the trip into Breckenridge for supplies, returning with food, cloth diapers, and 2 tiny knit caps purchased from the general store. "The folks in town are curious about you," he told Rachel as he handed her the caps, one blue, one green. "News travels fast that Jacob Quinn has a woman and twin babies holed up in his cabin." Rachel's cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry if I've caused gossip." "Don't be," Jacob replied with a wry smile. "They've been trying to marry me off for years. Most of them are just relieved someone finally caught me." "But I haven't," Rachel began to protest. Jacob laughed, the sound rich and warm in the small cabin. "I know that, and you know that. But Breckenridge thrives on a good story, and this one's too tempting to resist." As January turned to February, Rachel grew stronger. The twins flourished, gaining weight and developing distinct personalities: Samuel bold and demanding, Thomas quieter but more persistent. Jacob expanded his daily routine to include them all, bringing Rachel with him to check the animals, teaching her how to milk the cow and collect eggs from the chicken coop. "I've never lived on a ranch before," she admitted one morning as they walked back from the barn, the twins bundled against her chest in a sling Jacob had fashioned. "I grew up in St. Louis in my father's townhouse. After he died, I married Edward because he promised security." "Edward being the father who ran off?" Jacob asked, his tone carefully neutral. Rachel nodded. "He worked for a bank. Very respectable, very concerned with appearances. When the doctor said I was carrying twins, Edward became different, cold. Said his salary couldn't support 2 extra mouths. A week later he was gone, along with most of our savings." Jacob's hands tightened on the milk pail he carried. "Some men don't deserve the title. My sister wrote from Denver, offering me a home with her family. But then the stagecoach broke down, and the other passengers left with a passing wagon, taking my trunk and the last of my money with them." Rachel shook her head. "I walked as far as I could before the snow got too deep, and collapsed right where I could find you," Jacob finished quietly. Rachel stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Why did you help us, Jacob? You could have ridden for the doctor or taken us to town." "Wasn't time," he answered simply. "And after, well, it seemed right that you stay until you were strong enough." "And now?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. "I'm stronger now." Jacob looked at her standing there in the morning light, her copper hair gleaming against the snow, twin babies nestled against her heart. Something in him shifted, like ice breaking on a frozen river. "Now I find myself hoping you might stay a while longer," he admitted, the words feeling raw in his throat. "If you wanted to." Rachel's eyes widened, but before she could respond, a sharp cry from Thomas broke the moment. "He's hungry," she said, looking down at her son. "We should head back." Jacob nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course." That night, after Rachel and the twins were asleep, Jacob sat by the dying embers of the fire, turning a small wooden carving over and over in his hands. It was a horse he'd been working on for Samuel, though the boy was far too young for such a toy. Perhaps it was foolish to make it at all. Rachel would likely be leaving soon for Denver, taking the twins with her. The thought left a hollow feeling in his chest. In just over a month, these three souls had transformed his solitary existence completely. His cabin, once a quiet refuge, now resonated with the sounds of life babies crying and cooing, Rachel's soft lullabies, the constant gentle conversation between a mother and her sons. He'd spent 12 years in Breckenridge building his small ranch, content with his horses, his land, and occasional visits to town. Women had shown interest over the years: the pretty widow who ran the hotel, the school teacher who always saved him a dance at town socials, but none had touched that carefully guarded place in his heart. Until Rachel collapsed in the snow with her unborn twins, and he carried them all into his home and, unwittingly, into his soul. February brought milder weather, and with it came visitors. First was Doc Wilson, who heard about the births and came to check on mother and babies despite Jacob's assurances that all were well. "You did a fine job, Quinn," the older man said after examining the twins. "These boys are thriving, and you, Mrs. Dawson, are recovering beautifully." "Miss," Rachel corrected. "It's Miss Dawson now." The doctor raised an eyebrow but nodded. "My apologies, Miss Dawson." After the doctor came Martha Palmer from the general store, bearing a basket of baby clothes her grown children had long outgrown. Then Sheriff Mills stopped by, ostensibly to warn about wolves spotted near town, but clearly curious about the woman and children staying with the ranch's solitary owner. Each visitor left with the same impression that something special was developing between Jacob Quinn and Rachel Dawson. The way he watched her when she wasn't looking, the gentle way she touched his arm when passing him a cup of coffee, the comfortable silence they shared as they moved around each other in the small cabin space. One afternoon in late February, Jacob was chopping wood outside when he heard the approach of a wagon. He set down his axe and watched as Elijah Foster, the town's banker, pulled up in his fine carriage. "Afternoon, Quinn," Foster called, climbing down. At 45, Foster was a widower with 2 grown sons back east. He was also the wealthiest man in Breckenridge, a fact he never let anyone forget. "Foster," Jacob nodded, instantly wary. "What brings you out this way?" "Heard about your house guests," Foster said, removing his hat. "Thought I'd pay my respects to the lady, perhaps offer some assistance." Jacob's jaw tightened. "That's neighborly of you, may I?" Foster gestured toward the cabin. Jacob reluctantly led him inside, where Rachel was folding freshly washed diapers while the twins slept in a cradle Jacob had crafted. "Miss Dawson," Jacob said, "this is Elijah Foster. He owns the bank in town." Rachel smiled politely, setting aside the laundry. "How do you do, Mr. Foster?" "Enchanted, my dear," Foster replied, his eyes lingering on Rachel's face. "What a pleasure to meet a lady of such obvious refinement out here in our wilderness." Jacob watched as Foster charmed Rachel with tales of Breckenridge, offering to show her the town once she felt up to traveling. The banker mentioned his large house in town, his successful business, his connections in Denver. "In fact," Foster said, "if your destination is Denver, I would be happy to arrange suitable transportation for you and your children when you're ready to depart." "I make the journey regularly for business." "That's very kind," Rachel replied, her eyes flickering briefly to Jacob, "but I haven't quite decided on my plans yet." Foster smiled broadly. "Of course. No rush at all. In fact, I hope you'll consider Breckenridge as a potential home. We have excellent schools, a growing community, and many opportunities for a young family." He glanced meaningfully at Jacob. "Though I imagine Quinn's cabin is rather cramped for 4. Jacob's hands clenched at his sides. "We manage just fine." "Indeed," Foster nodded condescendingly. but a lady like Miss Dawson deserves certain comforts. My own home has 5 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and I employ a cook and housekeeper." "How fortunate for you," Rachel said mildly, though Jacob detected a hint of steel beneath her polite tone. Foster stayed for another half-hour, making thinly veiled comments about the rustic nature of Jacob's home and his limited prospects compared to a man of means. When he finally took his leave, Jacob walked him to his carriage, vibrating with poorly concealed anger. "She's not spoken for, then?" Foster asked bluntly as he climbed into his carriage. "That's not for me to say," Jacob replied stiffly. Foster smiled knowingly. "I see. Well, do pass along my invitation for dinner in town whenever she feels up to it. Good day, Quinn." Jacob watched the carriage disappear down the road, a knot of something uncomfortably like jealousy twisting in his gut. When he returned to the cabin, Rachel was nursing Thomas, her face thoughtful. "He seems prosperous," she said carefully. "He is that," Jacob agreed, stoking the fire with more force than necessary. "Owns half the buildings in town and reminds everyone of it daily." Rachel's lips twitched. "I noticed." "He's right about one thing," Jacob said after a moment. "This cabin is too small for 4 people. The boys will need space as they grow." "Are you asking us to leave?" Rachel asked quietly. "No," Jacob said quickly, turning to face her. "I meant I could build an addition, another room, maybe 2. There's plenty of lumber on my land." Rachel's expression softened. "You do that for us." "I would," Jacob said simply, "if you wanted to stay." Rachel looked down at Thomas, stroking his downy head. "My sister expects me in Denver." "I understand," Jacob said, though the hollow feeling in his chest expanded. "But I could write to her," Rachel continued, not looking up. "Explain that I've found a place for us here." Hope flared in Jacob's heart. "Is that what you want?" Finally, Rachel raised her eyes to his. "I don't know what I want yet, Jacob, except that I'm not ready to leave." It wasn't a declaration of love, or even a promise to stay permanently. But for now, it was enough. March arrived with its unpredictable Colorado weather, sunny, mild days followed by sudden snowstorms. Jacob began work on the cabin addition whenever conditions allowed, with occasional help from Tom Jenkins and his teenage sons from the neighboring ranch. "Never thought I'd see the day," Tom commented as they set support beams for the new room. "Jacob Quinn, building a family home." Jacob paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "It's not like that. She needed shelter, that's all." "Sure," Tom nodded, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "And you're adding 2 rooms to your cabin because you've always wanted more space for your lonesome self." Jacob couldn't help but grin. "Maybe I have. And maybe I'm the King of England," Tom retorted. "You're sweet on her, Quinn. The whole town knows it." "The whole town needs to mind its own business," Jacob grumbled, though without heat. Inside the cabin, Rachel was experiencing her own moment of clarity. She sat by the window watching Jacob work, the twins asleep in their cradle. Her heart swelled at the sight of his broad shoulders as he lifted a heavy beam, the careful precision with which he measured and cut each piece of lumber. For the first time since Edward's betrayal, Rachel allowed herself to imagine a future not the temporary refuge with her sister in Denver that she'd been planning, but something permanent. A home here, with Jacob. The twins growing up with space to run, learning to ride horses, having a man like Jacob to guide them. But what did Jacob truly want? He was unfailingly kind, generous with his time and resources. But did he see her as anything more than a responsibility he'd taken on that snowy night? A woman and her children he'd rescued, whom he was too honorable to abandon. The thought troubled her through dinner that evening. Jacob seemed quieter than usual, and Rachel wondered if he was regretting his offer to expand the cabin. "I received a letter from my sister today," she said as they sat by the fire after the twins were asleep. Jacob had ridden into town for supplies and collected her mail from the post office. "Mr. Foster kindly delivered it when he saw you at the general store." Jacob's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Foster. "What did she say?" "She's worried. I wrote to her about the twins' birth and our situation here. She's offered again to take us in." Rachel watched Jacob carefully as she spoke. His face remained impassive, but his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "That's good of her. When will you go?" "I haven't decided that I will," Rachel said. "I told you before I'm not ready to leave." Jacob set his cup down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Rachel, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." Her heart quickened. "Of course. Are you staying because you want to or because you feel you have no choice?" His blue eyes were intense, searching her face. "Because if it's the latter, I'll sell a horse or two and buy you train tickets to Denver myself." "Jacob, I don't want your gratitude," he continued, his voice rough. "I don't want you feeling beholden to me because I found you in the snow that night." Rachel stood abruptly, moving to stand before him. "Is that what you think? That I'm here out of some sense of obligation?" Jacob rose too, towering over her slight frame. "Aren't you? I'm offering you shelter, security. Foster's offering you wealth and status. Your sister offers family. What reason would you have to choose this?" He gestured around the small cabin. "You," Rachel said simply. "I would choose this life because of you, Jacob Quinn." The words hung in the air between them, Rachel scarcely believing she'd spoken them aloud. Jacob stood frozen, his expression shifting from disbelief to something like wonder. "Rachel," he breathed, reaching for her hand. "Do you mean that?" "I do," she whispered. "These past 2 months, watching you with my sons, seeing the kind of man you are, I've come to care for you deeply." Jacob's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I never expected to find someone like you," he admitted. 12 years I've lived alone, convinced that was my lot in life. Then you collapse in the snow and suddenly everything changes." "Is that a good thing?" Rachel asked, suddenly uncertain. Jacob's answer came not in words but in action. He drew her gently toward him, one hand rising to cup her cheek. His eyes asked a silent question, and Rachel's slight nod gave permission. When his lips touched hers, soft and questioning, Rachel felt as though her heart might burst from her chest. The kiss deepened slowly, years of Jacob's solitude and months of Rachel's fears dissolving in the warmth they created together. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Does that answer your question?" Jacob asked, his voice husky. Rachel smiled, resting her forehead against his chest. "It's a start." From the cradle came a small cry, Samuel, right on schedule for his evening feeding. Jacob reluctantly released Rachel but kept hold of her hand. "Go tend to him," he said. "We have time to figure out the rest." As Rachel lifted her son from the cradle, she looked back at Jacob with a smile that promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine before. April brought the first true signs of spring to Breckenridge. Wildflowers pushed through the melting snow, and the twins, now 3 months old, grew more alert and responsive by the day. The addition to the cabin was nearly complete. 2 new rooms joined to the original structure, with windows Jacob had purchased from the sawmill in town. Rachel stood in what would be the nursery, running her hand along the smooth pine walls Jacob had carefully planed and sanded. "It's perfect," she told him as he hung the door. "The boys will love growing up here." Jacob straightened, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "There's room for more if it comes to that." Rachel felt her cheeks warm. Since their first kiss, their relationship had grown steadily, but they had yet to discuss marriage directly. That Jacob was planning for a larger family touched her deeply. "One thing at a time, Mr. Quinn," she teased. I've got my hands full with these two for now. Jacob crossed to her, pulling her gently into his arms. And my hands are full with all three of you, he murmured against her hair. In the best possible way. That afternoon, Rachel was hanging laundry while Jacob worked in the barn when she spotted a wagon approaching. Her heart sank slightly when she recognized Elijah Foster's driver. "Miss Dawson," Foster called, waving as he approached. "What a fine day to find you outdoors." Rachel forced a polite smile. "Mr. Foster, what brings you out our way?" "I was passing by on business," he said, though Rachel suspected it was no casual visit. "I see Quinn is expanding his humble abode." "Yes, we needed more space for the children," Rachel replied, deliberately using "we" to establish her connection to Jacob. Foster's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, though I did mention my own home has plenty of room should you ever wish for more. Substantial accommodations." "That's very kind," Rachel said, "but we're quite content here." "Are you?" Foster asked, stepping closer. "A refined woman like yourself, living on a small ranch with a man who, while honest enough, can hardly provide the life you deserve," Rachel bristled. "Mr. Foster, I'm not blind to what's happening, my dear," Foster interrupted. "You found yourself in difficult circumstances and Quinn offered shelter. But that doesn't mean you're obligated to him. I could offer you and your sons a proper home in town, respectability, financial security." "Miss Dawson isn't obligated to anyone," came Jacob's voice as he emerged from the barn, his expression thunderous. "Least of all me." Foster turned, unfazed by Jacob's obvious anger. "Quinn, I was just explaining to Miss Dawson that she has options beyond this arrangement." "That's for her to decide," Jacob replied evenly, coming to stand beside Rachel. "And I'll thank you to respect whatever choice she makes." Foster looked between them, his lips thinning. "Very well, but my offer remains open, Miss Dawson. When you tire of playing pioneer, my door is always open to you and your children." With a curt nod, he returned to his wagon and departed. Jacob watched him go, his jaw clenched. "That man never could take a hint." "He thinks he's rescuing me," Rachel said, shaking her head. "As if I need rescuing." "Don't you?" Jacob asked, his expression suddenly vulnerable. "That night in the snow, wasn't that what happened?" Rachel touched his cheek gently. "You saved my life and the twins, but that's not why I'm here now." "Why are you here?" Jacob asked, covering her hand with his own. "Because this is where I want to be," Rachel said simply. "With you." Later that evening, after the twins were asleep in their cradle, Jacob took Rachel's hand and led her outside. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. He guided her to a small rise behind the cabin where a blanket had been spread on the new grass. "What's this?" Rachel asked, smiling. "Sit with me," Jacob requested, lowering himself to the blanket and drawing her down beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds and gazing at the stars. Finally, Jacob turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "When I found you in the snow that night," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, Rachel, you saved me. From loneliness. From a life half-lived." Rachel's heart began to race as Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed in the moonlight, a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he said. "My father gave it to me before he died, said I should have it for when I found the right woman." Jacob took a deep breath. "I never thought I would, until you." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as Jacob continued. "I know it's been just a few months. I know you came here by chance, not choice. But I love you, Rachel. I love Samuel and Thomas as if they were my own flesh and blood. And if you'll have me, I want to be a husband to you and a father to them for all our days." Rachel could scarcely breathe through the emotion tightening her chest. "Jacob." "Will you marry me, Rachel Dawson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you make a family with me here on this land?" "Yes," Rachel answered without hesitation, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, I will marry you, Jacob Quinn." His hands trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her all along. When he kissed her under the vast Colorado sky, Rachel felt truly at home for the first time in her life. The wedding took place on the first day of May, a simple ceremony performed by the Reverend in Breckenridge's small church. The twins, dressed in tiny suits sewn by Martha Palmer, watched with wide eyes from the arms of Tom Jenkins and his wife. The entire town turned out, even Elijah Foster, who nodded stiffly to the couple before departing immediately after the service. Rachel wore a dress of pale blue silk, a wedding gift from Jacob, who had ordered it specially from Denver. As they exchanged vows, she held tight to Jacob's hands, marveling at how this man, once a stranger, had become the center of her world. "I now pronounce you man and wife," declared Reverend Walsh. "Mr. Quinn, you may kiss your bride." Jacob's kiss was tender but held a promise of passion that made Rachel blush. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Rachel caught sight of the twins and felt her heart expand with joy. They were truly a family now, not by blood or accident of birth, but by choice and love. The reception was held at the town hall, with food provided by every family in Breckenridge. As they celebrated into the evening, Rachel found herself watching Jacob as he held Thomas, showing the baby off proudly to his friends and neighbors. Samuel dozed in her arms, unimpressed by the festivities. "You look happy," observed Martha Palmer, sitting down beside Rachel. "It does my heart good to see it." "I am happy," Rachel confirmed. "Happier than I ever expected to be again." "Life has a way of surprising us," Martha nodded wisely. 6 months ago, Jacob Quinn was the most confirmed bachelor in Colorado territory. Now look at him, married with twin sons and building a family home. "He's a good man," Rachel said, watching as Jacob gently rocked Thomas. "The best," Martha agreed. "And you, my dear, are exactly what he needed." She patted Rachel's hand and moved on to speak with other guests. As the celebration wound down, Jacob approached with a sleeping Thomas over his shoulder. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Quinn?" The name sent a thrill through Rachel. "Mrs. Quinn," she repeated, testing how it felt. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Jacob grinned, offering his free arm. Together they collected their gifts, thanked their guests, and climbed into the wagon Jacob had decorated with white ribbons and spring flowers. The ride home was quiet, both twins sleeping soundly after the excitement of the day. When they reached the ranch, Jacob helped Rachel down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Jacob," she laughed, "what about the twins?" "Tom and his boys are bringing them." Jacob nodded toward a second wagon just turning onto their property. "I asked them to help so I could carry my bride over the threshold proper." Rachel's heart swelled with love as Jacob carried her into their home, no longer his cabin, but their family home, expanded and filled with the promise of their future together. Later, after the Jenkins family had departed and the twins were settled in their new nursery, Jacob and Rachel stood in the doorway of their bedroom, a room that, until now, Rachel had never entered. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," Jacob said softly, drawing her into his arms. As his lips found hers in the soft lamplight, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that the night she collapsed in the snow had been not an ending, but a beginning, the first step on a journey that had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The years passed in a gentle rhythm of seasons, each bringing new joys and challenges to the Quinn family. Jacob legally adopted Samuel and Thomas, giving them his name and his unconditional love. The boys grew strong and healthy, with Samuel inheriting Jacob's quiet confidence and Thomas developing Rachel's quick wit and observant nature. When the twins were 2, Rachel gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, a tiny bundle with copper curls like her mother's. 2 years later came another son, William, who arrived during a summer thunderstorm that rattled the windows of their now spacious home. The ranch prospered under Jacob's careful management. He expanded his herd, built a larger barn, and earned a reputation for breeding the finest quarter horses in Colorado. Rachel kept a large garden, preserved food for winter, and even started a small business selling handcrafted soap and candles in town. On cold winter nights, Jacob often told the children the story of how he'd found their mother in the snow, carrying the twins. It had become family lore, the miracle that had brought them together. "And then I saw something red in the snow," Jacob would say, his deep voice captivating the children. "I rode Maverick closer, and there was your mama collapsed in the snow, carrying us," the twins would chorus, having heard the tale countless times. "That's right," Jacob would nod, "carrying you both, so I lifted them all up your mama and you 2 inside her and brought you into this very house." "And then we were born," Samuel would add proudly. "Right here in Papa's bed," Thomas would finish. Elizabeth and William, born in the safety and comfort of their family home with a proper midwife in attendance, were always wide-eyed at this part of the story, impressed by their older brother's dramatic entrance into the world. "It was the luckiest day of my life," Jacob would always conclude, reaching for Rachel's hand, "finding your mama and brothers in that snow." On a bright autumn day in 1888, 10 years after that fateful night, Rachel stood on the porch watching Jacob teach the twins to break a young colt. At 12, the boys were tall and lanky, serious about learning the ranch business from their father. Elizabeth sat nearby, her 7-year-old hands busy with a small embroidery hoop, while 5-year-old William constructed an elaborate fort from sticks at Rachel's feet. "Mama, look," Samuel called, waving as he successfully guided the young horse around the corral. "I did it," Rachel waved back, pride swelling in her chest. From inside the house came the cry of their newest addition, 3-month-old James, awakening from his nap. "I'll get him, Mama," Elizabeth offered, setting aside her needlework and rushing inside. Rachel smiled, marveling at how their family had grown. 5 children, a thriving ranch, and a love that deepened with each passing year. She often thought of how close she'd come to dying that night in the snow, how different all their lives would have been if Jacob hadn't found her. When Jacob finished with the boys' lesson, he joined her on the porch, wrapping an arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked. "How lucky we are," Rachel replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "All because you happened to ride by at exactly the right moment." Jacob shook his head. "It wasn't luck, Rachel. I was supposed to be in town that day, but something told me to check the fence line instead. Call it fate, call it God's hand, whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every day." Elizabeth emerged with baby James, carefully supporting his head just as Rachel had taught her. The twins released the colt to its mother and joined them on the porch, Samuel proudly describing his success, while Thomas added thoughtful observations about the horse's temperament. William abandoned his fort to climb onto Jacob's lap, demanding to hear a story. As the golden afternoon light bathed her family in a warm glow, Rachel felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. From death's door in a Colorado blizzard to this rich, full life, it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. "Are you crying, Mama?" Thomas asked, always the most perceptive of the children. Rachel smiled through her tears. "Happy tears, sweetheart," just happy tears. Jacob's arm tightened around her, his eyes reflecting understanding of her emotion. "Why don't you boys go wash up for supper?" he suggested. "Elizabeth, show William how to set the table properly." The children trooped inside, Elizabeth still carrying baby James with exaggerated care. Alone on the porch, Jacob turned to Rachel, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. 10 years, he said softly. Best 10 years of my life. Mine too, Rachel whispered. I love you, Jacob Quinn. And I love you, Rachel Quinn, he replied, kissing her with the same tenderness he'd shown on their wedding day. Forever and always. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their land, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged in this home, with this man, surrounded by the family they had built together. From the darkest night had come the brightest dawn. From a desperate collapse in the snow had grown a life overflowing with love. And as Jacob led her inside to the waiting chaos of their family dinner, Rachel sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to collapse in the snow that December night, and for the cowboy who had lifted them all and brought them inside, not just into the warmth of his cabin, but into the warmth of his heart.